I would like to welcome everyone here to the CCP annual conference of 2024. Good morning and welcome. It's wonderful to see so many friends and supporters here in the room with us today, and also to have a very substantial number of people with us here online. So hello and welcome to everyone who's online, and thank you to the team that's making that possible. My name is Ennis. I am a professor at the University of East Anglia and director of the Center for Competition Policy. The Center for Competition Policy is a world-leading research institute focused on competition, regulation, and consumer policy. Thus, we have a broader focus than what you might guess simply from our name. And within our DNA, we are a multidisciplinary center. We combine 4 areas of academic expertise: law, economics, business, and politics. Today's conference is special and different from most of the practitioner-style conferences one might attend, because actually this conference has a core academic base to it. And what we're aiming for with this event, and it's our signature, is to have a close interaction between relevant economic, business, law, politics research and actual practitioners and policymakers. And so this conference is intended to be helping academic research ideas get out to policymakers who might actually be interested in knowing the results, who might be informed by them, might even change what they do as a result. And so that is what we're here for today. And this year's conference is going to continue the CCP tradition of focusing on timely policy questions. Part of this involves certainly having a balanced perspective. We have no CCP position per se on issues. We have individual perspectives on the topics. And this conference, we aim it to be of substantial interest to practitioners and policymakers. So I encourage all the academics who will be speaking today to keep that in mind, that we have a broad audience out there with us. So in addition to the research that we do at the CCP, we have a variety of bespoke programs. And included among those, we have a PG certificate on competition and regulation. That's basically a one-year part-time set of modules, which we've developed to be very relevant and helpful for regulators and competition practitioners around the world, because it's a virtual program. We also have a PhD program, and I just mentioned one thing about it that's not so well known. It's possible to enroll in our PhDs part-time. And so for regulators, I think it's a really interesting option, potentially, if you're interested in going deeper into research on what you're dealing with. The part-time PhD is a definite thing to think about, even wherever it might be, but certainly we'd encourage you to think about doing so with us. Now, in terms of the main topics for today, I would just observe that across many business activities, from digital to energy, rail to water, foreign investment rules on security to rules on subsidies and CO2, increasing policy focus is being placed on regulatory outcomes. And that's occurring both in legislation and in government action. And this regulatory focus is not necessarily meaning that that competition law is viewed as the core and the core element of delivering market outcomes. There's a much more willingness, I think, in today's environment to focus on having directed outcomes. So we're going to be talking about where governments are headed in terms of ex-ante, ex-post regulation, and the role of competition law and considerations of market power in this new type of focus, which perhaps most dramatically might have been expressed in the recent passage of the DMCC in the UK, which is the digital oversight legislation that's been passed here. But it's not just UK specific. This is really happening around the world, and certainly in the EU, where there was the original DMA. So we're going to be talking about some of the factors that are driving these tendencies, some of the risks and benefits that they pose, and I very much look forward to the discussion over the next 2 days. Now I'm going to take advantage of my time here with you to talk about a little bit of my own research, because I just feel like it's part of my job. And so I wanted to tell you about a paper I've been working on, which I think might have relevance to today's topics. And the question is, what should we care when regulation restricts competition? That's the overarching question. And certainly if competition is making very small differences to the well-being of citizens, then a modest restriction on competition or via regulation might not matter. But on the flip side, it's a big question of whether regulations affirmatively seeking to benefit competition are helpful to well-being. Okay, so that's a core question, and it really matters a lot with the introduction of all the new regulations in Europe, the UK, the US, and other jurisdictions that are taking place. There's also a very strong movement to have a more direct industrial policy than in the past, and that is in some ways part of what's consistent with having a more regulatory approach. And so what I wanted to do in this piece of research, which is still not released, so you're really getting it hot off the presses here, is to focus on assessing how past experience with changing regulations may affect competition. And what are the trade-offs between pro-competitive and competition-restricting regulation? How important are the size effects here is the big question. And I wanted to look at quality effects, but it turns out that what we've done is to gather together instances of regulatory changes that have been studied in an academic or semi-academic form, and look at the impacts that have been found from these studies. 90% plus of them are focusing on price impacts. So price impacts is what we look at. But I would have been interested to look at a broader set of changes that have occurred. And so we've created a database. It was quite a complex process to create it, in which we reviewed papers from around the world, and even initially focused on OECD jurisdictions, but then broadened that out. We used the OECD as a mechanism for seeking more papers that we might not have found, and so we actually got some papers, especially in non-English, that were given to us to put into this database collection. What we've ended up with is reforms that run from between 1932 and 2011, and more 305 observations of reforms that encompass 39 different countries. And then we looked at I'll just talk about some descriptive statistics from this work, but it turns out that there's a median price difference of about 19 to 20%, and a mean of 23% price difference between regulations that restrict competition according to a specific set of criteria that we used and those that do not. So that's a much larger price effect than I was initially expecting to find from restrictions on competition. And we also looked at the extent to which regulations restricting competition had social objectives like health, safety, environment, financial stability. And there we found that there were lower price differences on the order of a 9% median and a 12% mean. Still very substantial. So this is illustrating some of the costs that policymakers need to keep in mind as they are considering the extent to which they want to have regulatory solutions that might impinge on competition. And so a big question then becomes, to what extent are the new regulations that we're talking about in this regulatory pivot actually enabling competition, and to what extent are they holding it back? And that's a question that I think we will find answers to in the rest of the sessions today, and so I'm looking very much forward to those. So certainly there are some limits to that research that I've just talked about, but I hope that the numbers can serve as sort of a launch point. We're going to be having 3 keynotes during this conference, one with Pierre Regibeau, who's the former chief economist at DG Competition, and then we'll have the president and vice chancellor of the University of East Anglia, who's going to discuss CCP achievements over the last 20 years. And we'll have John Davis from the Competition Appeals Tribunal, formerly of OECD, and who will be giving some of his thoughts on these new regulatory tendencies. So I'm really excited by both the keynotes and all the content that we've got coming up in the next 2 days. This is a conference that's happening at a time that is politically interesting. Intense electioneering here in the UK, but also we're deep into an election cycle in the US. There's an election now happening in France, and so there's a strong political context to the topics that we're talking about today. And I would just observe that they have been more present in political discussions than is normally the case in national elections throughout the world over the last 4 or 5 years. So one thing we cannot rely on is for governments to objectively critique themselves. And that's because institutions do not have an interest in giving a truthful outcome if the truthful outcome is not very positive. And so self-institutional assessments would tend to have built-in bias. And what that means is that I think there's a really important role for academic research in the coming few years to be evaluating the impacts of this regulatory pivot that we're talking about. I really want to encourage academics here to be thinking about that, and practitioners also to be looking towards outside evaluations and not relying exclusively on internal ones. So the subjects of today have truly international relevance. I want to note that we are recording the sessions, and those recordings are going to be released. So please keep that in mind as you speak. And we will be hoping to ensure very substantial audience participation. So I've been talking for a little while, but I'm going to stop. And then when we do have that audience participation, whether it's online or in the room, please identify yourself and your affiliation before making a comment or question. I would like to thank our sponsors for this event. So we have gold sponsor Clifford Chance. Thank you so much for all of your support and help. And also BRG, E.CA Economics, and NERA, thank you so much for your support as well. We also have members of the CCP, and I'll just mention them, the CMA, the FRC, the FCA, Ofcom, Ofgem, Ofwat, and the PSR. Thanks a lot for your involvement with the CCP over the last years. And at this point, I think I have to do a bit of housekeeping just to note that there are no fire drills planned. So if you hear an alarm, we actually need to leave. We leave by the doors we came in, okay? Then there are facilities outside and kind of to the left if you need any of those. And with that, I'm going to turn over to the first panel and to Kai-Uwe Kühn, who's Deputy Director of the CCP. Thank you so much, Kai-Uwe.
Thank you. Is it on? Can't hear me? Because it has green on there, and so now it works. So green means it's on, it also means it's off. It's very helpful. Well, thank you very much, Sean, and it is a pleasure to be here, and especially to head this panel. And you will have seen how special this conference is already from Sean's speech, because we've just kind of pushed into this a little economic experiment. And this experiment was about whether self-regulation works. So whether the guy who makes the rules can actually follow the rules without delegating enforcement. And I think Sean just showed again that that kind of doesn't work, because he took more time than he was allotted to. And expecting that, we made this first panel about the design of regulatory mechanisms in a context, in a very practical way, not as a theoretical exercise, but in the context in which you have externalities and you have multiple objectives. And you're going to see a number of these papers. I'm going to be trying to keep time fairly tightly. However, what we do want to have is a lot of participation. So there are, after every session, 5 minutes where you can ask your question. Please take advantage of that. I think all the panelists would love to have that discussion. And at the end, we have another 10 minutes to talk about this. Other announcement that I have to make, unfortunately, Alena has to kind of leave in the middle of the panel. That shouldn't be a problem, but just so you know that when she gets up, that she just has other commitments that she needs to deal with. Okay, then without further ado, our first speaker is Brook. She is an associate professor at the University of Leeds with kind of a long background, has something that's typical also for the CCP, I mean, a bit of an interdisciplinary angle of having both studied economics and law. And I'll hand off to you directly to talk about competition policy and the environment.
Put a timer to be good. Thank you very much. No? Oh, okay. Thank you very much for having me. I want to speak today about how competition authorities set their enforcement priorities and how this could or should be used to take into account inclusive and substantive growth considerations. This project, or this paper, which is still working paper, so we very much welcome comments, is part of a bigger project about how competition authorities across the globe set their enforcement priorities, which I'm conducting the past 5 years now together with my co-author, Kati Cesares from the University of Amsterdam. In this project, we take an interdisciplinary approach. So we start with the law, but we also have empirical research, interviews, impact work with competition authorities and regulators to try to decipher and expose how enforcement priorities actually work. When we use the term priority setting, we define it quite broadly as both the legal competence of each competition authority or other administrative regulatory agency, and their de facto ability in terms of practical resources, human resources, skills, budget, to choose which possible infringements of the competition rules to enforce, but also, importantly, which one to disregard. We show in our work that priority setting is one of major blind spots of administrative law enforcement, in the sense that in most jurisdictions across the world, it's defined implicitly by the discretion left to each competition authority to choose which cases to pursue and to which to disregard. And there's not much legislation, regulation, or even policy or academic principles on how this should be done. That also means, and I think it already refers to some of the initial discussion made, that there's no impact assessment principles of what's good priority setting. There's no discussion of what are the aims of priority setting. And even in the field of competition law, where we see a lot of international work by organizations like the E.CA and E.CA in Europe, there's not much harmonization or discussion when it comes to priority setting. In our previous empirical work, we looked at how competition authorities, especially in the European Union, the Commission, and the UK, have decided to self-regulate and decide which cases to pursue and which to disregard. One initial interesting finding is that when it comes to the Commission, but also a lot of the member states and the UK is included, most of the enforcement is highly reactive. If we look, for example, at the Commission in the past 20 or 15 years, we can see that 85% of the Commission's enforcement of Article 101 was done as a reaction to leniency applications or complaints. That means that the Commission did not take the initiative to decide if those are the right cases, if this should be the focus of the enforcement, but mostly reacted to external output. We also seen that for the competition authorities, and again, those statistics is about the EU member states, the Commission, and the UK, that have decided to self-regulate and to structure how they set the enforcement priorities. Most of their guidelines on how to do that, or the indicators, are based either on traditional economic growth indicators or practical reasons such as, are there enough evidence, or is it likely that the enforcement will be efficient in the sense that the competition authority has the right remedy to offer to such cases. We can see that some indicators relate, for example, to consumer welfare, to the impact on competition on the market or in specific sector. That means that the economic indicators look at the impact of a specific infringement on the economy as a whole. So you can think of consumer total welfare or efficiency, but does not zoom into the question of who are the benefits of the enforcement. Are there certain types of groups or individuals in society that will benefit from those enforcement? So this is not taken into account, but just more focused on what is the amount of saving for society as a whole. This might not come as a surprise to a competition law audience, because we know that in the 15 or past 20 years, the focus is on consumer welfare. But it could be quite surprising if we take a bit of a broader approach on how economic policies are being created and evaluated across the globe. So there is evidence, and Ezrachi et al. Paper from last year is a very interesting one, showing that actually disadvantaged and vulnerable groups and citizens across society are likely to experience disproportionate negative market outcome from anti-competitive practices. We also know that in the past, especially 20-15 years, international organization and domestic organizations take a different approach to assess the success of economic policy. So instead of focusing on consumer welfare or on efficiency, so traditional economic growth indicators, they are looking at certain measures of inclusive and sustainable growth. A lot of the pioneering work was done by the UN, by the Millennium Declaration and the Global Goals for Sustainable Development, which I'll show in the next slide. But this was also taken up by the OECD and many, many countries across the globe. The UK is also a very strong supporter of the UN's Global Goals for Sustainable Development. The Office of National Statistics has been doing a lot of work in the past 15 years to try to create economic indicators for sustainable and inclusive growth, to create it for designing policy, for assessing policy, for implementing policy. This was also was reinforced during COVID and when designing COVID recovery plans, such as leaving no one behind policy adopted by the UK. Each one of those programs have different terminology and different focus, but one common approach is the one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals from 2015. We can see here a wide subject topic of what falls under inclusive and sustainable growth. So starting from zero hunger to access to education and healthcare, gender equality, climate change, but also peace and strong institutions across the globe. It's quite interesting to know that a lot of those goals can also be seen as goals of competition policies according to different schools of thought. So we know that competition policy, by reducing prices, can and should help to access to certain markets like food, education, healthcare. There is a lot of academic writing and philosophical thinking about the link between competition law and uncoupling economic and political power, if you want to put it into peace and strong institutions. But still, when it comes to competition law enforcement and to setting enforcement priorities more specifically, most of us, at least in the past 15 to 10 to 20 years, will not think that those are goals that should play a strong role in competition law enforcement. Some of the resistance of competition law scholars, academic practitioners, to take into account those goals are the challenges involved in considering public policy within substantive competition law enforcement. When we say substantive, we are thinking of things like deciding whether there was an infringement of the competition rules or should be given exemption from the competition rules because of public policy considerations. This topic has been debated heavily, so we'll not go into details, but some of the resistance relate to the capability and mandates of the competition authorities, which are independent regulatory authorities that are not elected, do not have the political mandate to balance between certain types of economic or more political considerations. There are some practical challenges on how to balance between economic and non-economic goals, how you can do it practically. Questions about legal uncertainty, especially under the self-assessment regime of the competition rules. How can undertakings, how can law firms advise their clients on whether or not those objectives are justified? And there are some certain questions on should we use competition law as a sword in order to advance other types of public policies like sustainability, healthcare, energy access, or so on. In this project, we argue that even if you are against the considerations of those inclusive and substantive growth indicators within the substantive competition law enforcement, so namely if you believe that consumer welfare should be the main guide or the main framework, there are good reasons to take those considerations into account when it comes to setting the enforcement priorities. In order to design and show how this can be done and should be done, we're following the framework that was put forward by Nobel economist Amartya Sen and his capability approach work. And Sen suggests to have two modes of attack or two different avenues on how to take into account those inclusive growth indicators in any type of economic policy. The first line of attack is using distributive justice indicators, and the second is taking procedural, and I will discuss each one in turn and how it can be applied when it comes to enforcement priorities. So starting with distributive justice, Sen tells us that when we have normative evaluation concerning cost-benefit analysis, efficiency evaluation, social justice issue, development ethics, and inequality analysis, so all of those processes which we regularly do when setting enforcement priorities and when applying competition rules, the analysis should not solely focus on income, utilities, or consumption, so not consumer welfare centric, but also take into account the enhancement of capabilities. Capabilities, according to SEN, are defined as expression of people's potential functioning, such as well-being, being well-fed, taking part in the community, being sheltered, relating to other people, working on the labor market, caring for others, and being healthy. Again, this fits very nicely with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and other measures of measuring well-being that have been developed in the last 20 or so years. And we suggest that this should be taken into account when setting the enforcement priorities. So the aim of selecting which cases to take should not be just consumer welfare enhancing or total efficiency enhancing, but rather to provide capability to those vulnerable consumers or groups that might be harmed by the anti-competitive behavior. In the paper, we break it down and we explain how it can be taken into account. So this table summarizes, again, our previous work, where we broke down what we mean by priority setting to different stages of the enforcement, trying to flag what priority setting entails, how it's actually being done in practice, and how it differs from one competition authority to another. During the time restrictions, we'll not go into all of those stages, but we just want to flag that, for example, sustainable and inclusive growth can be taken into account where competition authorities set their agenda, which we define as a list of periodic areas of either sectors or anti-competitive practices where the competition authority declare in advance that it will focus on. In the past few years, especially in Europe, we can see the digital market was one area of priority which almost all competition authorities flagged. But you can also think that competition authorities will look at their own national markets in areas where vulnerable groups of consumers might be affected and use this as a starting point of the focus of their enforcement. Those kind of concerns can also be taken into account in the substantive criteria, meaning the guidelines that the competition authority adopts to decide in a specific case whether or not they will pursue a specific case. This is related to the graph I showed you in the first slide of what kind of considerations are taken into account. So currently, mostly focused on practicalities or traditional growth indicators, but this can also be broadened. Finally, impact assessment is an important stage of the enforcement where inclusive and sustainable growth can be taken into account. Currently, only 4 out of the 29 European competition authorities perform any type of impact assessment of priority setting. And even those that do perform use very basic and initial indicators like the total number of cases without really going into the question of who benefited from the enforcement, where did the cost saving go to what kind of consumers or groups. There are starting to be a bit of a change, and the UK is an excellent example. The new CMA priority principles from last October, for example, show a shift to this type of consideration of inclusive and sustainable growth. The CMA declares that we may prioritize work because of the direct effect would specifically benefit people who need help the most. Vulnerability can be context-specific and can be a range of forms. When targeting our interventions, we will therefore look at a specific context in which people may need particular help to protect them from harm and get a fair deal. Those priority principles also talk about disparities across the UK, about protecting the 4 nations, about type of vulnerable consumers, and how competition law enforcement can help. This is one of the only examples that we saw across the globe of starting to incorporate inclusive and sustainable growth, but there's not much discussion in the principles how it will be assessed ex ante, for example, when it comes to impact assessment. So this looks like a good start, but we think they can be also pushed and more formalized to make sure that those guidelines and standards will actually be used and implemented in a correct way. The second part of SEN's framework for inclusive and sustainable growth talks about procedural justice. The idea here is that we want to make sure that certain groups, and especially vulnerable citizens and groups in society, will have access to the competition enforcement authorities and can rightly and effectively represent their interests. There are different ways where we can try to enhance that. So we can see that a lot of the frameworks of potential is already in the competition law enforcement framework, but it's not being fully utilized. So in the paper, we're going to talk about third-party participation and how that can be used in order to foster competition, more inclusive and sustainable growth, about possible role of NGOs and consumer organizations, how complaints and the procedure to submit a complaint can be reformed in order to foster those types of claims. We're going to talk about reasoning. So certain competition authorities should reason their decisions, for example, not to open an investigation. And we can see that those authorities, like the Netherlands, that need to explain why they did not take up a case, tend to take into account inclusive and sustainable growth just because of this procedure. I will skip that because of time. I'll just end by a very nice quote by FT Commissioner Rebecca Kelly-Slaughter that she made 2 years back when talking about how competition policy can affect race equality, and why we should take into account inclusive and sustainable growth, even if we use a consumer welfare-centric, sustainable, substantive competition law enforcement. So she stated that you are necessarily picking winners and losers when you do any enforcement or fail to do any enforcement. And I'd rather that we be aware of who those winners and losers are and what effect of our enforcement decision have on them on sort of a greater economic structure. So in any case, no matter if we explicitly take into account inclusive sustainable growth consideration or not, competition law enforcement will have this effect. We suggested that this needs to be formalized, discussed, and made more explicit in order to make sure that competition policy actually serves the groups of society that we believe that will benefit the most. As I mentioned before, there is still no paper. It's in the process, so we'd love to get your input. But this is some early work that we have done if you're interested to read and hear more.
Thank you very much, Or. I think we're going to take the discussion and then we're going to open up for some questions. Alena, please, if you would step up. Alena is currently a consultant in an economic competition consultancy in the E.CA Economics. She's been, though, through several regulators, has been chief economist at What? That's what I thought. And has also had a stint at the CMA. So she's known these questions both from the ex-ante regulator, the competition policy angle, and also from private practice angle. And so I'm looking very much forward to your comments.
Superb. So thank you very much for having me. I decided to use my time to focus actually on Or's presentation and think about how actually this prioritization may look like in practice in one area which has actually got quite a lot of interest already, which is sustainability and how we can marry sustainability and competition, and whether they work together. So let's see. Okay, so when I thought about it, I'm a practitioner, so I tend to think about things from first principles. I thought there needs to be a problem that we are trying to solve, and on the way to the problem there sure must be some milestones. The first one, what is the gap that we are trying to breach with this new approach to enforcing, or rather not enforcing, antitrust? What are the options once we've identified the problem? Actually, is competition the right tool? And then we will start adapting our rules, and in the end, it will end up in a nice work of quantification. That may be the theory, but I feel that in practice, we are kind of starting halfway there. We haven't really spent much time on defining the problem, thinking about the gap or the options, and we've started with the rules. So we know that the European Commission has its green guidance, the CMA has its green guidance, quite a few European authorities now have their own green guidance. Now, what does this mean? if we go sort of row back and think actually what is the problem we are trying to solve, for me the key problem is that sustainability by definition does not work with competition very well. It's where you have market failures, it's where you have externalities, something that the markets just do not deliver well. Our traditional solutions to that is regulation. So before you get to the sort of half point that I highlighted, you need to think that you have a market failure where competition by definition doesn't work, and you think that actually regulation is not the right approach to fix it, right? And if you go into it with this mindset, it will influence where it takes you, and there will have to be automatically some trade-offs, and we'll have to think about them very carefully. Now, what does the economic theory think about that? I mean, economists have been thinking about this for a while, and they are, on the whole, quite skeptical. They do worry about interfering with competition as we know it. I chose three of sort of my favorites. The first one is Martin Peter Schinkel, and with his collaborators, I could have chosen any number of Martin Peter's statements. He is actually quite skeptical, but I think this quote is quite nice because it suggests that when consumers value sustainable products, then why would we need any exemptions from competition rules? Markets should deliver. But for me, it's all in that when, which is, for me, going back to my first point, if you have a market failure, then clearly consumers are not doing something that leads to the right outcome as we see them for the planet. The second one, and I feel that this is kind of an attempt to address some of those concerns. This is the suggestion that actually the actual purchasing decisions by consumers may not show that consumers actually really value them. I found that, you know, a way of squaring a circle. It seems like a very convenient answer. It's consumers are not valuing it, therefore we have market failure. Well, they may not be valuing it right. That's a sort of strange finding in my view. Now, the last quote, which I found interesting, actually, it's my paraphrase, it's not a quote, is from Johannes Paha, and it's quite a recent one, where he's basically thinking about the problem that we have as a classic Nash equilibrium, and we are getting from A to B, and A is the current situation, which is not great, and into a B, but you need to get there through coordination, and it's a classic prisoner's dilemma. But again, the bit that I have underlined, it assumes that you are getting from one outcome to another, but the other one is more valuable. But privately valuable, not for society, but for the companies involved. And that, I think, is a problem, because for a lot of the cases of sort of transition to a cleaner technology, this is not just going to cost companies, which is where the Nash equilibrium comes in, but it's also not clear that privately for them it's a better equilibrium. So that is something that I think is another sort of a big if and big condition. So from my perspective, we are already starting in quite a difficult position, both where we started with the rules and where the theory stands. So where are we? Where can sustainability agreements actually be useful in practice? And I would like to first direct your attention to the DG Comp quote. And for those of you who like physics, there's a famous Fermi paradox. That, you know, if physics suggests that there should be life on other planets, you know, where is everybody? So I think this is kind of an antitrust paraphrase of the Fermi paradox. You know, where are all those cases of agreements that should be exempted? That's what DG Comp was asking. But the practitioners had an answer to that, or have an answer to that, which is there are. You're just not seeing them, and people are not brave enough coming to you with them. And if you think about it, there is plenty of scope for actually these agreements in particular to be brought forward. If you think about old industry practices that need to be phased out, or new industry standards that need to be agreed upon, which may lead to actually more expensive ways of producing. Joint procurement, sustainable input, joint R&D, etc. So there's plenty where you can imagine that actually transition to a cleaner practice, to more environmentally sustainable production would necessitate coordination. Now, all this depends, of course, on companies being able to show that there are benefits to society. And there are rules where the competition authorities say that they would accept these benefits, and they broadly, I mean, I chose the European nomenclature as my guide because I find it quite confusing. So you have these use benefits and non-use benefits, which is basically in the market benefits. Then you have collective benefits that accrue to all of us. And they must be larger than the harm to consumers. If you look at my little flags, and you know your flags, you realize that in the European Union, all the benefits have to be in the market, and in some other jurisdictions, like in Germany, while some other jurisdictions, like the UK, for example, or the Netherlands or Austria, are a bit more open-minded, so you can take account of these wider benefits. For me, this is absolutely crucial, because that links us to what is actually a market failure. Right. What is a market failure? It's something that we are not internalizing through our individual decisions. So excluding these externalities is, for me, a sort of key flaw. Now, so where does it lead me? I feel that we just haven't thought through very carefully where we are in this process and whether there is a market failure to fix. If there is, how likely is regulation to be effective? If there is a first mover disadvantage, have we fully identified it? And also, we often can feel if there is any regulatory impetus, it means that actually we don't need these agreements. But regulation is often highly imperfect. And it often needs the industry to implement it. So I feel that there's so many reasons why we've sort of worked a framework that we don't think we've come to it with so much hostility that we didn't give ourselves enough levers to make this actually happen. And that you can see in the different approaches of the jurisdictions. In particular, the safe harbours, which in my view are completely unsafe. One of them, which is actually both in the UK and in the EU, just 20% of the market. Think about all the markets I suggested where you might see benefits of this. They'll be highly concentrated markets. One player may have more than 20%, so let alone any players who are getting together. And also, we are talking about costs that are not being internalized. For that, you need an increase in price. So where does it leave me? I have run out of my time. The intentions are good, but we really need to think carefully through how do we make it happen, because at the moment the Fermi paradox reigns supreme. No aliens have landed on Earth, and there are very few cases of sustainability defense.
Thank you very much, Alena. We've just heard two fascinating talks, and I have about 1,000 questions, certainly on the first one, and then almost as many on the second. So I think you probably also have questions. I would like to kind of just collect two, and then have a round of a quick response. Anybody who feels that they're even able to ask a question or prioritize which is the most important one. Sorry? Online. Yes, please. Okay. So we're going to have that question read online.
Testing? Okay. It's a question for Brook. How can a competition authority aged under 15 years, located in a democratic country, having political appointments at the leadership level with limited in-house expertise, with no strategic sense of direction, decide its priorities? They tend to flow with the winds or immediate pressures.
Okay.
1 minute?
And he said, yeah, 1 minute. No, I'm gonna make it 2 questions, and if no one has one, I'll formulate one. No, and you're already seeing that there are loads of practical issues kind of that come up in your paper. There are questions about, specifically competition policy. Let me just one relatively practical question throw at that. So it's certainly the case, I think, Alena, what you were talking about, that sometimes companies could do things much faster than regulation could, for example. But we also know that the instruments that competition policy has are pretty limited. And what worries me very often that one thinks competition policy can do a lot. And if we're practically looking at it, I've done this, I know Pierre Regibeau has done some back of the envelope calculations, that sometimes the benefits that we're getting, for example, with CO2 emissions that are reduced, are very limited relative to the other things that we're looking at. So are we overburdening competition policy with that and taking people off the hook that should really make the political decisions for real regulation? That's my first order concern, right? If I want the right regulation in place.
So thank you. 2 great questions, which will be very difficult to answer very fast, but I will try. So the first question about political appointments, and if we have political heads of competition authorities, would they know how to balance between competition and non-competition interests? Would they do it in a way that safeguards the credibility and legitimacy of competition policy? Yeah, this is one of the big challenges. In the priority setting project, when I showed the typology of what are the 7 stages of priority setting discussions, one of them is the procedure to prioritize. And there we look at who in the institution takes those priority setting decisions. Is it done by a vote, by a unilateral decision of the head of the competition authority? Does that need to be reported and discussed? And we found out from interviews with competition authorities that this procedure makes a huge difference. Again, in a nutshell, one way to safeguard against those political heads of competition authorities is to adopt either by legislation or internally by the competition authority as a measure of a good policy, a good process to consider decisions of investigations. So we can see some competition authorities where they have fixed meetings in the diary every month or 2 months, where they have a broad team within the competition authorities, which can have a good representation in terms of backgrounds, gender, race, but also age, for example, and that those decisions of prioritization are being done in a formal way within those meetings. This is one way to safeguard, but of course there's many different discussions, and I also have a feeling the question hints maybe to more protectionist fears against competition policy, but it is something that we also discuss in the Modern Law Review article, which I shared the QR code for. The second question is, if I can rephrase, so sometimes we can think that when it comes to sustainable and inclusive growth, competition law enforcement can do so much, but it requires a huge burden. I agree, or it's not what you meant. That requires too much from the competition authorities.
It probably requires other instruments than the competition authority has, and you're then thinking you're solving a problem which you really haven't. You've only scratched on the top of it.
Yeah. So I agree, and I think it's also links to what Alena talks about. Can competition law enforcement really further sustainable and economic growth? And I agree with almost all of your points about the Commission and National Competition Authority guidelines and why they don't work. I dedicated a lot of my research to the role of public policy in competition law, and still I wouldn't know how to apply the guidelines to a specific case. Having said that, so I think those are good reasons why not to take into or to limit the taking into account of public policy within substantive competition law enforcement. Mm-hmm. So why we shouldn't use exceptions in order to limit the application of competition rules. I think in the paper we're talking about something slightly different. which is a question how we can use competition law enforcement to prioritize the sectors or practices which actually do have a significant impact on those questions. Sustainability might actually not be one of the clear candidates, but more a question of should we focus on specific products that actually make up a big part of the spending of lower income class, or access to healthcare markets, or to education.
Excellent, and we're going to have a chance to continue that discussion at the very end, unfortunately without Alena, who has to go. But let's get to the next contribution. Farasat Bokhari is a professor of economics in Loughborough University of Loughborough, He has been a long-time CCP member and now CCP affiliate, who's worked a lot on pharma and health economics issues as an IO economist. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Kai-Uwe. Can I also request you to give me a verbal prompt halfway through at the 10th minute, because I can't see those numbers from here. But I'm going to try and keep an eye over there as well.
If you look forward, then that's all.
Okay. So with that, can I have my slides? Okay, yeah. So we've been talking about regulation and internalities and externalities. So this paper is related to that issue. One can think about, how do you do regulation in markets which have such strong amount of both internalities and externalities. On one side, we worry about sort of destructive policies or prices which break or don't allow for investment to go on. But on the other side, we also worry about in these type of cases when we're talking about, for instance, alcohol market or something like that, where you're creating a price floor, that can it create some sort of a device or a focal point for firms to sort of coordinate on and increase the prices. You do want to try and curb the consumption of alcohol because of its effects and so on. But the worry is that will it lead to some spillover effects onto parts of the market where they were not intended. And so this particular study is going to provide an ex post evaluation of looking at alcohol market, one specific area, where there was a price floor that was put in place for very cheap alcohol. And what we're worried about is what did it do? Did it actually work? First of all, did the alcohol consumption go down? Or did it just lead to prices going up, people continuing to buy and purchase just as much alcohol? Now they just have to pay more for it. And did it have knock-on effects on other groups, for instance, who were not drinking as much? So that's where this particular paper fits in as an ex post analysis. Let me then start with that. Okay. Oh, the screen. Okay. So looking at the background in terms of why we worry about it, so clearly, alcohol has lots of harmful side effects going on. That's where the concerns start from. Countries around the world have different policies in place to curb the alcohol consumption. Price floors is one of them, which is a new one, started in Scotland and then later on in Wales as well. But there are other mechanisms that have been tried as well, and some of those regulations have worked, some have not worked so well. So for instance, you can place taxes. There's quite a lot of studies that have looked at that, and there's a lot of concern that how much is passed on, how much does it affect the margins, and so forth. There are other policies that have also been put in place. For instance, again, in Scotland, there was a ban on non-linear pricing, so, volume discounts. So you cannot do buy two for one type of things. That was an interesting policy as well. Should have worked. Actually, it didn't. It led to more alcohol drinking. That was something that I discussed 2 years ago in this same forum. And here we have a different policy, which is the minimum prices that came in. Other policies that have been tried are, for instance, restrictions on the hours when you can purchase the alcohol or days of the week and so forth. So lots of different regulatory tools are available. And here we're just going to look at one particular one in terms of the minimum prices. Now, the data that we're looking at is actually coming at the time of COVID. That's when the policy was kicked in. And around that time, there was a surge in demand for alcohol. Why? Because everybody was sitting at home, you couldn't go to restaurants, and people started purchasing a lot of, well, toilet papers, apparently. But along with toilet papers, they also went for buying a lot of beer and purchasing it and consuming it at home. So this graph on the right-hand side is just showing an overall surge in these type of things. So our paper considers price controls for the opposite problem, that there is an abundant supply and there are low prices. So alcohol was relatively quite cheap, which could overall drive harmful excessive consumption in lockdowns and become habitual beyond the public. So the two places where this policy was enacted, first one was in Scotland back in 2018, and then later on in Wales in 2021. There has been some work done looking at the earlier policies. So for instance, Griffith et al. Took advantage of the start of the minimum unit price in Scotland, using, again, difference between England and Scotland, and essentially reported that they had a 5% increase in prices and 11% decrease in consumption in Scotland. This actually 11% is on average for the households that were drinking a lot or had very high level of consumption. For them, this number actually is around 15%. So it seems to suggest that it was fairly well-targeted policy if it's going after the right places. But one of the differences is that this policy in Scotland was introduced when there was no pandemic. Now we had, in Wales, a surge in demand going up, and there were other policies that were already in place in Scotland. So for instance, I mentioned earlier, which was a policy on buy 2 for 1 type of things that was already in place. There were also some restrictions on where alcohol could be placed inside the stores. So all those things were already over there, whereas in Wales, these other conditions were not present. So we are going to focus on what is the policy's effect in a pandemic when problems with excessive consumption of cheap alcohol can be more acute. But we also have a particular problem over here in terms of trying to figure out the effects over here. So one, we have both the policy kicking in, but there's a second effect that's coming in, which is that there is a lockdown at the same time. So effectively, we have two changes coming in at the same time. And we have to try and disentangle, if you're going to do ex post analysis, that how much was the effect of the policy and how much was the effect of the pandemic itself on these things. So we can examine the take-home alcohol sales using the usual diff and diff method, the pre-post policy introduction. And we have two types of potential controls available to us, and we're going to use both of them to try and disentangle the effect of the policy from the effect of the pandemic itself. So the two potential type of controls are, think of it this way. Here's the treated set of products. These are the products that were very cheap, and you've imposed a price floor on them. So they have to be sold at a much higher price. There are other products, other alcohol, which is not affected directly by that policy. These are the more expensive alcohol. So that can essentially be a sort of a control that you can use. The second type of control that you can do is you can take the same products in country A where the policy is placed and take exact same products in country B where the policy is not imposed and compare these. Both of these controls come with their own set of problems. They're not perfect controls. This is not an ideal world. In the first case, you can have spillovers going on. Spillovers can happen that you impose a price floor on one set of products. That jacks up their price, but manufacturers and retailers react to that, and it ends up affecting the price of other products. So if you were ending up using those as your control, you sort of have a contaminated control over here. Then there could be a problem into doing cross-country comparisons. The cross-country comparison problems can arise because you have pandemic coming in, but the pandemic can affect the different types of products in the two countries differentially. So if they have differential effect in different countries, again, you cannot tell how much is the effect of the pandemic versus of the policy. So what we're going to try and do is put bounds on these things and look at some types of assumptions that need to go in, check whether those assumptions hold or not, and see if we can put some sort of reasonable numbers on it. Okay. So some minor details of how we're doing it. We have a whole bunch of products available from one large provider. Tesco's data is what we were using. We have it at the stock keeping unit level, where we can observe products like Coors Light 6-pack, 330 ml as our sample, would be one of the items in the sample, and then we have 2,500 or so of these particular stock keeping units. Our period is 104 weeks, 78 weeks before the policy kicked in, remaining weeks 26 weeks after the policy. And then we have data essentially from Wales, from England, from Scotland, from Northern Ireland. So we have plenty of labels over there. We converted all this alcohol into stock keeping unit, from amount of volume of liquid that is there into units of alcohol. So a unit of alcohol is 10 milliliters of pure ethanol. Thank you very much. Main measures that we look at what happened is quantity, but quantity not in just volume, but in units of ethanol or units of alcohol, expenditure per customer, and price per unit of alcohol. And why we are interested in expenditure or expenditure per customer, because obviously with such a policy there is a concern that is it doing, is it potentially letting Tesco reap some profits or not. So we don't actually do demand estimation proper in that sense to figure out the margins and so on. That's in a different ongoing work. Here, we're just looking at, first cut at it, what did it mean in terms of expenditure per customer? And per customer, we have to be careful because we have a very crude measure of it, which is the total number of people that visited Tesco in that week, rather than people who bought that thing. So we divided the products into 3 groups. The 3 groups were those products that over the entire pre-period are always are never below the 50p limit. So these are clearly your potential control groups. Then there are other ones that are either always below the 50p or part of the year are below 50p because of promotions and so on. So we had to take some sort of rules over there and figure out how do we classify them. We cut them into 2 different groups. We call them MUP2 and MUP3. And we looked at where the breaking lines were to try and figure out which products go into MUP2 and then into MUP3. And for robustness checks, we did other ways of also classifying them, which are reported in details in appendices somewhere. So first cut, before we do anything else, this is just the raw data. Without controlling for anything, it basically shows how much was the change in demand going on an average week. Averaging over all these periods. So MUP3, which is the set of products that we are interested in, which were the very cheap alcohol, their quantity decreased by 34.9% in Wales, while for MUP2, which is the intermediate range, which can be on promotion coming down below 50, but generally is above it, and MUP1, which are always never below it, their products increased by 18.5% and 19.7%. So the higher-end alcohol sales went up. For the cheap one, they went down, just as a simple average. The mean quantity treated for all products, all 3 products groups in England, in the meantime increased. So that was the surge that was going on. When people were going out buying toilet paper, they were also picking up a lot of alcohol. And in Wales, MUP3 prices increased by 30.3%. These are the cheap alcohol, so they went up again to the roof. They increased by 30% as the raw price. And then other prices for other 2 types of products are also listed on this slide as 7.8% and 0.7%. Okay. I'm going to show you some regression results after this. I'm going to walk you through those. But before you do that, I think this is the key graph. This actually tells the story. More than anything else, without any regressions. This graph actually on the left-hand side is showing you the quantity, and on the right-hand side is showing you what happened to the prices. They're both in logs, and then the prices, and they're color-coded for England and Wales based on blue for England and red for Wales. And what you can see, starting from the graph on the right top side, is you can see that the red line is fluctuating around as an average price, and then comes the day on which the prices have to go up, and suddenly you see the average price going up, and that's the effect you see on the price for that particular product. These were the very cheap alcohol. On the left, you see the quantity. And on the quantity, you can see how much it declined in England relative to Wales. Below that are the other two, MUP2 and MUP3, MUP1 and MUP2. MUP1 is the control products. You don't see much change going on there, which suggests that there isn't much of a spillover going on. But of course, econometrics might tell us otherwise. Now, one result that I'm not going to show you over here is that we did do an overall demand estimation on this as well into 3 groups of products, MUP1, MUP2, MUP3, to try and figure out the cross elasticity to see that if the price of one set of product goes up, how much does the demand for the other product changes. And it turns out that yes, between MUP1 and MUP2 there is a positive cross elasticity, and between MUP2 and MUP3 there is a cross elasticity, but MUP2 is really a buffer zone. There is almost statistically 0 cross-price elasticity between 1 and 3. So there is almost no spillover effect. It seems to look like that this will work quite well. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of this and start going into the main results. Sorry. So, and the overall methodology. So we're going to use 2 types of methods. We're going to use difference and differences and triple differences. And the way the triple differences will work, just to explain in this simple graph over here or this table, is that we're going to look at the difference in difference between any set of products across 2 different countries. So we do that simple difference, and from that we subtract out the difference in difference in the MUP1 products. So the MUP1 products are the ones that were controlled, that were not the target. But it could be that if you're using those as the potential controls and they're being affected differently, then you subtract out their, the effect on those as well. Okay? So that's why it becomes a triple difference. And without putting in all sorts of controls, if we just look at the effect over here on raw data, just the averages, that's the effect that's given up there, that we get something around 51%. So what we're interested in is estimating this econometric equation. There are essentially 3 parameters that we are interested in finding out. These tell us everything, and I'll show you the results just about those 3. Beta 5, which is listed over here, is essentially capturing the effect on MUP1 products. By assumption, if there's no spillover, then we should see that effect to be 0. If there are cross-country differentials between how COVID affected product sales in England versus Wales, that's what's going to be captured by this particular variable. And then to get our effect on MUP2 products or MUP3 products, MUP3 are the main products that we are interested in. The coefficients we are interested in measuring are what are listed in beta 10 and beta 11. And if we were using slightly different set of assumptions, that whether or not the effect of COVID is identical across different countries, then we can use the diff and diff simple strategy, because then even if COVID affected things, but it affected things identically across Wales and in England, then that difference can be taken out, and we just can do a simple difference in difference. So that we can also get by adding these coefficients together, which is what's listed in the bottom of this thing. So here is the overall results that we find. Where we see the quantity effect, we see 58% on MUP3 products, roughly 58%, well, 44%, sorry. 44% is the effect on the quantity of MUP3 products. And then we say, well, if we don't care about just the MUP3 products and all this terminology, what is the overall effect on demand? That's given by these 2 numbers at the bottom of the table, which is showing you 24.1 and 19.5. These translate into roughly range of 17 to 21% decline in quantity based on different assumptions that we're getting. And we can also look at the prices and the expenditures, what happened to those. The effect that we get on prices is around 13%. Whether we use set A assumptions or set B assumptions that give us the different estimates versus the triple difference estimates. So the price effect is pretty similar. The quantity effect is, you can think of it as being driven between these two temperatures. This is the overall result. The rest, let me just summarize this result over here, because after this, most of the slides are just going to show you robustness checks and falsifications and so on, which most of you will not be too interested in. So here's the main results from the primary analysis. So we see that the quantity decreased by 44%. No significant change in sales of MUP2 products overall. And then MUP1 beta 5 means that the lockdown country differentials between England and Wales that is not attributable to the MUP regulation indicated 4.6% higher quantity. The combined effect was, in terms of the quantity, is 21.4%. And then for MUP3, quantity decreased by 44, and MUP2, 5%. And these numbers are actually quite close to the ones that I quoted from Griffith as well a little while ago, where I said that their quantity decreased by 11%, but for the problematic part of the demand, it was around 15%, which is a different country that they did it with. The rest of the stuff is that we are doing basically checking these assumptions for different diff versus triple diff. One way of checking these things is, okay, let's take out the policy effect and just look at the COVID effect. How do you do that? Pick two countries where the policy didn't change. That's what we do in trying to figure out comparing England to Northern Ireland, because there was no policy introduced in either of those. That gives us a sense of how much of the contribution we can make to the COVID being differential, having a differential effect between countries. I'm going to skip the result, but basically it comes back and says, yes, there's a little bit of difference between countries of COVID. That means that you should be looking at the triple difference results that I was quoting before, rather than focus more on the double difference. That's the essential bottom line point of that analysis. Other than that, we did a whole bunch of other, how am I doing? Time, okay, I'm out. So let me just skip, the rest is just similar type of robustness checks. The main point over here is that we find that minimum unit pricing as a price control can be very effective in reducing demand for cheap alcohol. It's very well targeted. It's not leading to any spillover effects. It's not, our analysis, initial analysis is not showing that the expenditures per consumer went up significantly because of that policy. So we do not think Tesco was the primary beneficiary, Tesco or other retailers in general were the primary beneficiaries of this policy. And so I think it can work both in Scotland, we've seen through the literature, it worked in the non-COVID times. Here, even in the COVID times, we're seeing that it seemed to have worked quite well in Wales as well. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farasat. I will do a very brief discussion of the paper before I open up the floor for questions. And what I want to kind of take you through is just at a helicopter view that abstracts from a lot of the details about the kind of why this is a really good economics paper, but also why all of these elements are highly relevant for how we're thinking about impact assessment and ex post evaluation. Because I think that's really important, that point about what kind of evidence goes into what, and understand that. And I think this paper is a really nice opportunity to demonstrate that. So he's really starting from three things. That's kind of the typical economic analysis. We have a problem here where the question is, if we're trying to limit consumption of alcohol and those for those people who are in danger under circumstances like COVID, if we're raising the price, is that going to raise the price for everyone or not? Or can we have this as a targeted intervention? That's a question that one can theoretically not completely resolve, but what one can resolve from economic theory is what it depends on. Namely, is there substitution between this cheap, high volume consumption, alcohol, and kind of the more expensive alcohol that you would be buying otherwise. That means we don't know from theory what exactly happens, but we know what to look for in order to ask the question, what is likely to happen with an intervention like this? And he does that in the paper as well, and essentially estimates and kind of finds that, yeah, there's not that much substitutability if I'm looking between these product groups. So that's kind of the first step that we always want to take also when we're thinking about impact evaluation. We want to kind of see, what does it depend on? Look around whether there is some evidence that tells us something about this, and then evaluate on that basis whether the risks or the benefits are likely higher or lower, right? But then actually, for good public policy, we want to look back at the end because maybe we got it wrong. Maybe there are things here where we didn't anticipate influences that are important and that aren't there already in the literature, and go that further step towards an ex post analysis, and that was the core of what Farasat has been doing. Now the thing though for Farasat was, he was really lucky that he could do this. And as an academic, it's great. You look at the data where there's the right experiment, even if it's a little bit difficult, that makes it actually better because you do something new, right? But you look kind of under the lamp where it says, here is an experiment, or you can construct it as an experiment that gives you the answer. The issue that we have in public policy is that in a lot of these cases, we don't have that information. And even if we're imposing ex post evaluation, if we don't take care, we're just not going to have the data to actually do that in the best way. An example I came across in Germany very recently was one of the laws in the postal sector that was supposed to protect postal delivery people. They wanted to do an ex post analysis, went to all the government agencies for the statistics, and they said, well, we don't collect these statistics because we don't need them for the tasks that we have. So I think there's a really important point for policy design. It's really important to do impact assessments, to actually base things on facts and kind of anticipate issues. But the second one is that you really need to write into the law, not just that there has to be ex post evaluation, but also design the ex post evaluation and put in there the collection of data that is actually necessary in order to do that. And I think that's not done systematically enough. I think there are more and more attempts that we have recently to get around impact evaluation and assessment. And that's particularly problematic in circumstances where we have lots of regulatory change and where the ex post evaluation is particularly important. So that's why I thought this was a great paper as an example for this. Further questions? If there are no immediate questions, oh, there's one. Yes.
Thanks. I'm Tanya Salem from BT. Thanks for the really interesting presentations and discussion. I wanted to ask the panel whether you saw the tension between having a multitude of policy objectives, and the UN development goals are great, but also the democratic legitimacy of competition, independent regulatory and competition law institutions, and then on the data collection side, as an economist, I completely agree. It would be really helpful to have more ex post impact assessments that are based on good data. But at the same time, if we have a lot of policy initiatives and all of them require different data sets to be collected, given that I work for BT, and we also are subject to a lot of these information requests, that can involve a significant transaction cost. Thanks.
Okay, I think great question. If you allow me, I would, because it's really, the whole panel should talk about it, I think. I would like to postpone that after the next talk, if I may. Yes, Andreas.
I have a question for Farasat, which is, do you have any regional data to look at any cross-country spillover effects, because even during COVID, in most parts of Scotland and Wales, it wasn't that difficult to drive over the border to Tesco's in England and take advantage of, alcohol offers that weren't available at home. So how confident are you that the decrease relative to England might not also hide a regional spike in the English regions closest to Scotland and Wales? Thank you.
Should I answer it now?
Yeah, I'll do that one. Okay.
So for this paper, no, we do not have subnational data. It does exist. For instance, one could repeat this type of an analysis from another data set, which is the Cantor, a little bit expensive to get. But what we have done in the past is, for a different policy, used a localized version where we did have regional information. That was the placement of products in stores as well as the buy 2 for 1 type of things. And there we saw that regional effects were not showing up. Primarily, it was staying with the right targeted families that were consuming too much of alcohol. So particularly for alcohol, we typically see that about 75% of alcohol consumption is restricted to less than a third of the households that are consuming a lot of it. And that's not so much of a regional issue, it's more of whoever is drinking more. So this policy was targeting specifically those who were drinking very cheap alcohol.
All right, and then I'm going to skip directly to Michael Harker, who is going to he's the head of the Department of Law at Queen Mary University in London, and he'll be coming back to our sustainability topic, but this time from a regulatory perspective, less than the competition perspective.
Yes, and Michael.
And I'm sorry. Yes, you're going to switch out in the middle, or how?
Yeah, towards.
Okay. And also his co-author Paula Kohn, who is a solicitor and consultant in the energy sector. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much. This paper is very much work in progress. It's part of a project, a UKIRC, the UK Energy Research Centre funded project with Monica and others in the room. So what we, as part of the theme, one of the things of that project, we were looking at the implications for the institutions of regulation in the energy sector. If I could think of 2 words to associate with all the reading that I've done over the last couple of months, it would be change and transformation. And that's not just the sector itself, but also the institutions. And it's actually, I've been looking at energy regulation for a long time now, rather longer than I perhaps wanted to, but the last 3 or 4 years, there has been that transformation in terms of institutions. And maybe there is some form of a lag in terms of institutional reform actually following what needs to be done in terms of achieving net zero. So that's a broad kind of context for the paper. Sorry, I'm going backwards here. So what we'll look at very quickly is just what the net zero target is, what the challenges are specifically for the energy sector, and then this need for a new institutional framework, where we're at in terms of developing that institutional framework. And then I'll pass over to Paula, who's going to talk a little bit about the empirical work that we've done. That was done in last year, I think from October to November, look at kind of 7 elite interviewees. Sorry, I keep on going the wrong way, but the first principles. Okay, so if we're thinking about first principles in terms of regulatory design, we'd say the importance of regulatory independence, independence from industry. That's not really the focal point here, but really independence from government in terms of being able to make kind of long-term commitments in terms of regulation, and that's an important precondition of efficient investment in the industry. But then we've got the problems, and it's a theme that I'll keep on referring back to, of regulators, independent regulators, bureaucrats, if you like, making political decisions, and there being a legitimacy gap there. So you've always got this tension where you're designing regulatory institutions. And then the other point, just building on that, is really the energy sector, particularly in the last decade or so, is particularly prone to politicization. And if you needed a recent example of that, just think of where we are in terms of the electoral cycle, net zero now in terms of the main political parties in the UK retrenching their positions because of the perceived costs on the basis of consumers of net zero policies. And that's happening in this country, it's happening across Europe. So there is that risk in terms of what we're trying to achieve in terms of net zero. One other thing that we normally refer to when we're talking about energy regulation is the energy trilemma. So essentially we're talking about these tensions between different goals of energy policy. So at the top of that kind of the triangle there, we've got security of supply, affordability on the part of consumers, in particular vulnerable consumers, and also the central focus today in terms of decarbonisation. And there's clearly tensions between those. If we're investing in more expensive technology, that's going to have implications for costs on the part of consumers. It may be in terms of security of supply that some of these investments, there's intermittency on the part, solar and wind, etc. That has implications for security of supply. So there could be kind of tensions within this trilemma. On the other hand, I mean, when you start to read the policies now, the policy papers, they talk very much actually about there being complementarity, if you like, between these goals. So in terms of decarbonisation, in the long run, that will can result in cheaper prices for consumers, particularly in the context where wholesale gas prices are very high. It could be also that the less reliant we're on imports of gas, the better we're off in terms of security of supply. So it's not simple trade-offs between these different parts of the trilemma. The important question here really is it's a question about who decides on these trade-offs, who decides on these different priorities. Okay, so that's quite a lot by way of context. Just in terms of the industry, what we're looking at really is a transformation in terms of the supply side, in terms of generation, and also in terms of consumption. So we're switching away from gas, that's a trend that's been underway for some time, to green technologies. What we'll also see, and I'll talk about numbers in a moment, but we'll see a steep increase in demand for electricity. Part of that is actually the consumption of consumers changing. We're talking about the installation of heat pumps, etc. We're also seeing potentially the use more of smart technologies that goes beyond smart meters. Also storage being used kind of locally by consumers. These are electric vehicles, EVs. And part of that also requires a very significant investment in the infrastructure. And that's really where we're at the moment in terms of trying to rebalance these different mechanisms of supply of electricity and consumption. Okay, so the net zero challenge, and I'll get on to some of the legislation now, and I'll go through it reasonably quickly, but we've got the actual target there. It's a statutory target contained in the Climate Change Act as amended. So it's really there that the Secretary of State is under a duty to ensure that the net UK carbon account for 2050 is 100% lower than the 1990 baseline. Now, part of this I need to go through this part. Part of this is part of that duty. The Secretary of State must produce a carbon budget for each successive 5-year period from 2008, containing a limit on emissions. And that has to be set 12 years ahead of time. So at the moment we're on carbon budget 6, and the reduction there is 78% against the 1990 baseline. That's important because that lays down, not just for energy but other sectors, agriculture, etc., but it lays down policies and proposals to actually go to achieve that target. And it's laid down in law, it's scrutinised by the Climate Change Committee, etc., and also the courts. So there's been 2 very significant judicial review cases on Carbon Budget 6, where actually the Secretary of State was invited basically to redraft because it wasn't specific enough in terms of the proposals. What is important for energy, that's a 2050 target. They've actually brought that forward for energy. So this was the Johnson government. By 2050, 95% of the British electricity should be low carbon, and by 2035, we'll have decarbonised electricity altogether. So that's a really ambitious target for energy. And just in that table there, you can actually see how quickly we're seeing reductions according to the carbon budget in emissions. So from 54, these are megatons of carbon dioxide per annum, down to 8 for carbon budget 6. So really, really steep decline in terms of emissions. What that means is a steep increase in capacity and investment in terms of these green technologies. I won't go through the numbers there, but you can see you can see how challenging this is in terms of investment. So investment is really core to meeting the net zero target. Yeah. Okay, so the need for the institutional framework, a lot of this goes back to, there's a very important report by the House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committee back in, it seems a long time ago, but it's not actually that long time, 2022. They said a number of things. They wanted to limit the role of Ofgem, maintaining its role as consumer protection and competition and economic regulation. There was a need for a new regulator or a new layer of regulation, which I'll come back to in a moment. Reform of price controls. They made this point about political trade-offs. This is really a question for government rather than the regulator, and that's really been the orthodox position over time. And they recommended this task force to set up this coordinating role in order to achieve net zero. And these 2 quotes here, the first one, the importance of coordination in achieving the target across government. And the second one, that we need to rethink about the way in which retail is regulated, and said something there about switching, which I won't talk about. Okay, what happened then was actually there was another report, the Skidmore report, Mission Zero. So that was an inquiry set up by the Liz Truss government, recommended this Office for Net Zero Delivery coordination function across government. That recommendation wasn't taken on by what was then the next government, but the government responded by setting up the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Still some questions, I won't read out that quote, but still some questions about whether there is an effective coordination across government in terms of delivering on net zero. Just conscious of time, this was a diagram I kind of started drawing for myself, and I thought it was quite useful because it does show all of these new layers of regulation. So just a couple of things to note. How does the government actually communicate to the regulator how it should prioritise its, the different goals within that trilemma that we talked about? Well, crucial to that is the strategic policy statement. That's the main mechanism to communicate to Ofgem. And then we've got the new regulator, which is responsible for the transmission of electricity, and this is the National Energy System Operator, NESO, and that will, even though it's a licensee, it is a public corporation. It hasn't quite taken on the role yet, and it will be responsible for the whole energy system approach. So the government is still working through exactly, and the regulator is still working through exactly what that new layer of regulation is going to do. but they all come together within this what's called the Central Strategic Network Plan in terms of designing the new system in order to be able to get there to net zero in around about 11 years. I'm just conscious of time, and I don't want to crowd out Paula's part, but there are questions about the strategic policy statement, the extent to which it can be used effectively to prioritise these different priorities, different objectives. So that's out there now. Question about whether that's an effective vehicle to achieve that. The statutory duties, one of the really significant, I'll end with this one, but one of the really significant things that did happen, contrary to the government's initial plans, actually in the Energy Act 2023, there is a new duty now for the regulator to achieve or have regard to the Secretary of State's need to achieve its their net zero, the target, but also the 5-year carbon budgets. The importance of that is it kind of builds the carbon budgets into the regulator's duties, so that could have really significant implications in the future, something to be worked through. But I'll hand over to Paula now so that she can discuss some of the interviews.
Would you like to stay and have reflections at the end? Because I'll be brief.
No, it's fine.
Is it fine? Okay. That means I'll have to handle this. So is it here? It's the other side. So let's go to the most interesting bit of the research we've been doing, the findings. So to conduct this research, we made some interviews with leading expertise in the field. We conducted 7 interviews in total between October and November last year. And these interviews was supposed to last between 30 minutes, 1 hour. But they were very engaging, and I was very pleased to extend some of the interviews up to 1 hour and a half, discussing hardly about this topic. So we divided the interviews in, I skipped this one, in 3 main themes. First, I was asking questions about the role of the regulator. Then we move on about what will be the interrelationships between the regulator and government. And we finished the session asking more about fairness and affordability and how this could be seen as a challenge and how to overcome these challenges. So most of the findings were very interesting in a way that they shared, most of the interviewees, they share common ground in many aspects of the questions we were asking. So in terms of the role of the regulator, for example, I asked them about what would they think should be the role of Ofgem, for example. And the most of them agree that it should be more interventionist and more proactive in various ways. Not only Ofgem itself, but the coordination with government, which moves on to the middle bit of the sequence of questions. They also agree that there's a need to more focusing in the consumer as the proper essential role of Ofgem as a whole, but the focusing needs to be in a way that is more effective. And they also pointed out that there's a need for encouraging a lot more innovation, especially in terms of the grid, developing more flexible grids in the market. This is essential for not only achieving net zero, but also to achieve the affordability in the market. In terms of the interrelations with government and regulator, they welcome the idea of having net zero duty as something that is more clear, but also the need to be more clear among what is the role of Ofgem in deliberating all this agenda linked to net zero, and what is the role of government, so they can work together in a better coordination towards it. And this leads to a more strategic coordination that resonates with what Brook said here early about we need a better coordination to achieve sustainability. And if we're thinking about vulnerable consumers in the energy markets, especially in the time of crisis, we need to consider that this is part of the sustainability agenda. We need to do these things. And we need to do so with more independence and accountability. So Ofgem needs to encounter more accountability, and this, the clearance of what they should be doing would help with this recognition of what accountabilities are that Ofgem needs to take. And then we moved on to the last part of the interviews where we were asking about affordability and fairness. I asked, and there was some intriguing answers around that I can even show you in the next slide. Because I'm conscious of time, I give you some time to see some of the quotes, the juicy quotes that we got from the interviews. So in terms of fairness, there was the discussion about what is it fairness and how can we achieve that when it comes to implement new, is it price-wise, is a price cap? What is the instrument that can provide fairness in these grounds? We also asked about regulatory innovation, and it was pointed that this is essential. It goes back to the necessity of having more flexible grids available, and how the industry needs to be more, not the industry, sorry, but how Ofgem could intervene more deeply with companies to get them to do what is required to do in the right time, in the right framework where all net zero is being structured. And going back to the last bit, fairness, there was a discussion in relation to how we can achieve fairness together with a net zero very complicated agenda. And the discussions were that it's quite complicated to discuss the interrelationship between government and regulator in terms of this. And I will summarize this by saying, but going back to a quote that you used earlier from Rebecca Kelly. Who are the winners and the losers in all this? So Ofgem needs to be focusing, concentrating in these winners and losers, and get the job done in a way that is more effective, integrates the government, the Ofgem, and society in ways that pursue their goals and achieve net zero, which is a huge, immense challenge. So if you want to, do you have 30 seconds for Michael to maybe summarize? Is that fine? All right, then.
I think,
well, thank you.
I think there's going to be a chance to say something more. So let's have a very brief comment from Sean, and then we're going to open it up for the last questions. In particular, the one that I've skipped before will be the first that we're going to pick up.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a very fast comment. I think you had a list of 3 features that you considered fundamental, including independence, for example, as one of those features. I think it might be worth considering adding one more to that list. Easy to say, but it is that that the regulations have to be incentive compatible for the private operators. And what I mean is that there's a a very reasonable argument to be made that that we need a massive change in the investment cycle that will ultimately lead to to meeting the objectives of net zero. But when those objectives are met, suddenly the investments might not be worth as much as they were expected to be at the beginning, because prices might fall substantially of electricity. And so this is a major issue that is just not on the table and really needs to be considered much more deeply.
Great. As promised, I wanted to get back to your question, which was a conflict between data collection side and a lot of policy changes. Would you mind just very briefly restating it so that...
Yes, of course. I mean, the main question, I think, which is useful in our presentation was whether the panel sees a tension between democratic legitimacy and a multitude of policy objectives for an independent regulator. Thank you. I think that's the main one that I think.
Yes, which kind of picks up on the last point. Maybe Michael, and then Or.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's an inherent tension, and I think it's always been there, and I don't think a solution has been found, and also it isn't a binary question either about what is a political decision, what's a regulatory decision. What you're seeing now, especially with sectors that are now more politicized like energy, is that there's an acceptance that there needs to be a dialogue between the regulator and government, and that dialogue needs to be structured to maintain independence. But you do need to have that dialogue.
So yeah, excellent question. I think we tried to offer one solution. So again, the Modern Law Review paper that was published 2 months ago, which I'm trying to push forward. What we say that, yes, there is trade-offs and tension when it comes to independent regulatory authorities between multitude of goals, between effectiveness, efficiencies, independence, legitimacy, and transparency. We think that even within this framework of each national setting, in each national room, and the room that leaves for discretion, there are certain tools that can help to alleviate this tension. For example, when we talk about agenda setting, so flagging certain sectors or practices as a priority for the next year or the next period of time, you can think of agenda that is set externally to the competition authority by the legislator, for example, which I think is similar to the strategic network plan that you've mentioned in the paper, which is a great example. You can think of third-party participation in setting this agenda. So we see in certain countries, like the Nordic countries in Europe or the Netherlands, they ask for public consultation and take it quite seriously in setting the enforcement priorities. That leaves room for NGO, for certain public interest group to come and help to alleviate this legitimacy concern. You can think of external metrics that are set, again, external of the competition authority, ex ante on how to measure the success. I think that can help a bit. But I think the bottom line that not taking decision is also illegitimate. We see certain competition law enforcement focusing on luxury products. Without opening to too much political discussion, you can ask if the digital market enforcement is not about market that does not really help the disadvantages group of society. So if we don't take that decisions, we already made the decisions in a way.
Okay, I will now close the session because I've got very strict instructions not to let our next speaker wait, who's already, I think, online, but will be seen in a second. It is Pierre Regibeau, who many of you know as a long-term academic. Some of you will also know him from his involvement with consulting for a long time, and he was also, as you all know, the latest chief economist at DG Competition. Hopefully not the last. So far, he seems to be irreplaceable. And without further ado, welcome Pierre Regibeau for his certainly interesting talk on this topic.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning or good pre-lunch. It's a pleasure to take part in this conference. Thank you for having me. Now, I was asked to talk about the supposedly increasing interaction between regulation and competition policy. As you realize, this is a topic on which it's possible to speak for a very, very long time without saying anything. But being an ambitious man, I will try to say at least a very little, but in a very short period of time. So what is kind of my point of view? From this point of view, the first thing is that it's certainly not the point of view of DG Comp for another year plus. I'm supposed to say that under penalty of near death. So I thought that I made it pretty obvious even during my term that what I was saying was not always what the Commission thought, but apparently I have to keep having this disclaimer. Now, when one thinks about the relationship between competition policy and regulation, one has to start from the basic, which is that we operate in an economy which is very, very heavily regulated in many different ways. Now, that goes from, legal strictures, which we can think of as very soft regulation, to kind of stronger kind of brick and mortar type of regulation. So it starts with legal framework. Property rights, of course, are an essential basis for competition policy to operate. We do encounter interfaces between competition policy and IPRs, labor law, contract law, environmental law, international law, and so on. So clearly, at this level of the softer regulation, the interaction is plentiful. There's another kind of regulation, which is a consumer protection regulation, imposition of safety standards, testing and approval, privacy. And there too, there can be interaction with competition policy, competition law. Now, the nature of this interaction might not be the same, and we'll come back to that in a moment, but interactions, that certainly is. And then there's this regulation in the old textbook kind of meaning of it, the kind of quasi-Stalinian regulation, where in a given sector, there is direct overview of price, output, investment, vertical integration, all kind of decision. Okay. So having that in mind, let's us ask whether there's been increasing regulation. After all, if the topic is increasing interface between regulation and competition policy, one of the reasons might be that there's been increasing regulation. That's as simple as that. There clearly has not been increasing competition policy. So when we look at that, however, we see that we come from a now distant past, maybe not that distant for people as old as me, which is a case where we had fully regulated sectors in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. That included certainly airlines, energy, telecommunication, railroad, although not in the US for the railroad. We also had and still have heavily regulated sectors. Pharmaceutical has always been heavily regulated, it still is. So is banking, so our financial markets. So certainly not on that side, and one has to look for potential increase in regulation. Because actually, if anything, there's been a decrease in the stricture or in the strength of regulation, since in many of those sectors, the tendency has been away from treating them as a whole based on the assumption that they were kind of natural monopolies, and moving to a situation when one only heavily regulates what are identified as a specific natural monopoly elements in the vertical chain in those sectors. So that, in a sense, has certainly been a decrease in the amount of regulations that we consider. Okay? So clearly, the perceived increase between the relationship between regulation and competition policy cannot come from an increase in the tendency to regulate. If anything, the tendency has gone the other way. So what it has to come from maybe is a change in the nature of regulation, in the nature of competition policy, and also of the way that politicians and society overall kind of looks at the role of competition policy. And let me develop this theme. Before we go there, although it's a little bit boring, it's still kind of worth going back to the textbook discussion as to what is different between regulation and competition policy. And from that point of view, actually, is pretty good place to start is Dan Sparder's book on regulation. He's spent a lot of time thinking about this issue. So going quickly through what should be a familiar list, clearly, regulation looks at market failures. While competition policy, with an exception I mentioned later, usually doesn't, it looks at market power. Now, Dan Spelberg, being a bit of a Chicago guy, thinks of market power itself as a market failure. I don't. I think that it's very logically and practically thinking of market power on one side and market failures on the other one. It's much more productive, much more convenient. Another thing, of course, and that's going to be important when we discuss very briefly things like the DMA, is that regulation proceeds from general rules, while competition policy proceeds case by case. One can probably overstate this difference because, of course, while competition policy proceeds case by case, it builds up to jurisprudence and guidelines, which are some kind of less than binding rules, but rules nonetheless. So also, the enforcement is at the level of enforcement. Right? Regulation is ongoing, day-to-day, month-to-month enforcement, and comes mostly from the public side. When we look at competition policy, it is occasional enforcement, and while it is enforced by a public body, usually lots of the initiative, including the compliance that motivates the action of the public body, come from the private sector. Maybe because of the different type of enforcement, there's also a difference between a repeated process versus more occasional encounters, which has, of course, implication in the term of the different risk of capture. It is well known that the risk of capture tends to be higher with repeated regulation from dedicated regulators than from, the one-type come and shoot type of investigation that competition policymakers are involved with. There's also a distinction between looking at behavior, which is really what the regulation tends to do, versus looking at both behavior and structure, which is what competition policy does. And then finally, while regulation is mostly an executive process, in most countries, the competition policy is implemented through a quasi-judicial process, although the extent to which there's a difference depends a lot between the US, where it's really a quasi-judicial process, and the EU, where it's kind of a hybrid in between. So again, to think about the interaction between those two, it's important to know what the differences are, because the fact that the difference raises a possibility, so they might also be complemented one way or another. So keeping those differences in mind, let's just ask why and how and where regulation and competition policy interact. Now, I could come out at least with kind of 5 kind of rationale for an interaction between the two. And I will come back very quickly to some of those rationale. Right now, I'm just going to the list. So first one is that regulation can be gamed by dominant players. And because it can be gamed by dominant players, there might be the need from time to time for intervention by antitrust authority to put an end or at least control this gaming if it is anti-competitive. Also, regulation can create or entrench market power through different mechanisms, through the given of exclusivity, but also because regulation is usually easier to deal with for large companies than with smaller companies. I've already mentioned the different characteristics of regulation and competition policy, and we'll see that in some contexts that does make them complementary to look at given problems. There's the sharing of expertise, and I would argue that there are reasons to assume that this has led to an increased need for collaboration between antitrust and regulation, and for interaction between the two. And then finally, I would argue that the fact that in the EU at least, DG competition deals not only with antitrust and mergers, but also with state aid, also creates a natural link between regulation and competition policy. First, let's discuss a little bit the gaming the regulator, or as I say, the competition policy as the US Marshals. For those of you who are familiar with those kind of cases, you know that this kind of role for competition policy started in earnest, or at least got a lot of publicity with the AstraZeneca case, where the competition authority essentially intervened to punish AstraZeneca for using loopholes in the regulation in order to prolong its position as dominant provider of a given anti-acid drug. There was a similar case again for anti-acid in the UK with Reckitt Benckiser, where here essentially what Reckitt Benckiser had to do was just essentially exploit the stupidity of the local regulator in order to find a way again to kind of delay the effective entry of a generic version of one of his products. And again, there was intervention from a competition policy because it was felt that the way Reckitt Benckiser took advantage of the failing for the regulator could not be justified as competition on the merit, and it had serious anti-competitive effects on the relevant markets. But gaming also happens with some of the softer kinds of regulations that I evoked at the beginning of my presentation. For example, in IPRs, one of the main theme of Kai-Uwe's tenure as the chief economist at DG Com was to look at the process of SCP and SCP licensing and see how some feature of the litigation process could be gained by some companies, which led to restriction onto the conditions under which things like injunctions could be brought and so on. In the division, in the medical service, there was also the intervention in terms of pay for delay, which as a practice could easily be seen as a thinly disguised market sharing agreement. And more recently, the Commission has been investigating the use of division general patents in litigation. So again, examples of interaction between competition policy and some type of regulation. And I think we should expect, increasing such intervention as we, tend to regulate the environmental aspect of business activity more closely, and as we introduce more stringent rules in terms of privacy. Faced with this kind of new regulations, the firm will look for loopholes. Some dominant firm will look for loopholes to further enhance their dominance on the market, and there will be therefore a further need for intervention by competition policy. So this type of intervention of competition policy in the domain of regulators in the sense has been increasing and will, I think, be increasing for the foreseeable future. Now, as I've already mentioned, regulation itself can be a source of market power, either because you're given a legal monopoly before it was on a whole sector, now it's on an element of the sectors, or because you have essentially managed to capture your regulators, or because large companies are better to deal with very complex regulation than small companies. And that's, of course, one of the concerns that one has with something like the DMA, that can look very complex, and that the larger companies might be able to essentially figure out and possibly gain before their smaller rivals can. And then also because multi-product companies can exploit the position in a regulated segment in order to gain advantage in a regulated sectors. Right? So that's another reason, of course, why there interaction between regulation and competition policy is that just like IP can be a source of market power, regulation itself can be a source of market power. So that's something that existed a long time. I don't see that necessarily becoming worse or less. So that would not necessarily help explain an increased interaction. I come to the sharing of expertise. And there's always been, of course, sharing of expertise. Each time the competition policy regulator gets involved in an industry that is heavily regulated by more specific regulators, they can gain from talking to the regulator. When you do pharma cases, it's nice to talk to the people who regulate pharma. When you do energy cases, even if you are not in the regulated part of the sector, it's always nice to tap on the expertise of the people in the energy sectors and so on. Fine. But there's something that goes beyond that. Once you get into a complex and rapidly changing technology, this need for interaction gets bigger. Why? Because, after doing a number of energy cases in a very static environment, most competition policy people and economists have a decent background in energy economics and can essentially figure things out for themselves. On the other hand, when you launched immediately in a broad sector that is deeply affected by a new and changing technology like digital, you are essentially looking for life vests. And those life vests can only be found in other sectorial expertise from other regulators. There are also other kind of situations where some sharing of expertise is needed. It's not just in regulation, in interaction with sectors that are regulated per se, or whose one main element is regulated, but also in the increasing interaction between industrial policies and competition policies. Whether we like it or not, industrial policy is on the rise. As I've argued somewhere else, I think the wrong position would be to just say, look, industrial policy is a stupidity, it works counter to competition policy, we're going to fight it all the way. No. There are reasons for having industrial policy. So the role of people in competition policy is to find ways of convincing the people who want industrial policies to design them in a good way, in a way that makes sense for society, and such a way usually is much more compatible with competition policy than what politicians can initially come up with. But of course, that again presupposes the sharing of expertise. Sharing of expertise again with the people familiar with the sector, again with the people who are maybe familiar with the international investment and international trade aspect of those industrial policies. And I see this sharing of expertise increasing and therefore leading to increasing interaction between competition policy and other forms of regulation, not only because of this emergence of the digital economy that is not only quite important and covers a lot of sectors, but keeps changing relatively fast. And I don't think this is a technology that we should expect to settle or to be understandable on a routine basis kind of anytime soon, but also because of this increased desire to implement some forms of competition policy. Now, the interaction between competition policy and regulation also depends on your view of competition policy. And there's essentially kind of two views that I can distinguish. One is, competition policy is just a toolbox for the government, in our case, for the Commission. So it's part of a number of tools, so a number of objectives, and you will combine those tools as well as you can to deal with objectives. So for given objective, for given issues, it's going to be completely natural to have regulation and competition policy work with each other, or at least getting out of the way of each other. We're a bunch of complements, substitute sometime, we're a toolbox. The other one is a more, old Timberman view of things, saying we have objectives, but we also have plenty of instruments. So to the extent possible, let's make sure that we use an instrument mostly for the one or two or three objectives it is best suited for. And I would say that until quite recently, most economists would have held the second position, and that explains the resistance, it just makes sense, a healthy resistance to having competition policy involved in absolutely kind of every aspect of the governmental and especially European Union policy. On the other hand, I also do believe that, with the complexity of today's world and the increase in the number of societal targets, societal objectives like greening, labor market development, and so on, that come to the forefront of the policy agenda, it's about unavoidable that competition policy is somewhat involved in achieving more than the traditional objectives that are essentially linked, attached to them. We have to be careful in the way we do this, but this is unavoidable. So in that sense, sense, the rise in this kind of increasing number of societal objectives that we want to tackle is also a reason why we're going to have an increased cooperation or interaction between regulatory instrument and competition policy instrument as seen as using different tools, different complementary tools to address these issues. Now, two more points before I conclude. There's another, I think, more subtle reason why there is interaction between competition policy and regulation. And that's the fact that DG Com, as I mentioned, has also to deal with state aid. Now, state aid has nothing to do with market power. State aid really, like regulation should, has to do with market failures. But of course, precisely because we have to deal with state aid as well, we have to make sure that when you deal with state aid, some of the manners in which we deal with state aid, some of the principles that we extend to state aids do not contradict some of the approach we have in competition policy. So we have to be, careful about the notion of market definition. We have to be careful about, when we look at the competitive consequence of state aid, we of course have to go back to the notion of market definition, and increasing market power possibly. So because we deal with both, we're in a position when we cannot avoid the issue of making sure that what's being done in the name of solving market failure might be at least conceptually compatible with what is done in the name of limiting market power. I will conclude with just a quick reference to the DSA and the DMA, asking for kind of what kind of animals they are. Now, the DSA, when you think of it, is quite traditional regulation, right? It assigns kind of and monitors duties to kind of large platform, to those gate holders and gatekeepers, say up there, yes, fine. And one would hope that most of those assignments are at least motivated by some notion of perceived market failure. So in that sense, I don't have too many problems making the DSA fit with the traditional approach of, more or less soft regulation. Now, when you look at the DMA, it's a little bit harder because there's no link whatsoever to market failure. A lot of energy is devoted in trying to convince us that it's not really a competition policy, that it is kind of something different. So what is it? Well, I've already given a view of the DMA in the past. And the view that in the past was the pragmatic view, was saying, okay, there are issues that might be competition issues, but after we've gone through a number of cases and so on, rather than have to keep enforcing the cases, once we identify kind of behaviors or issues, or especially behavior that should be forbidden or at least regulated, then rather than run cases again and again or relies on jurisprudence, maybe it is useful to kind of ossify that a little bit within a more regulatory framework like the DMA. Now, the other view that I offer today, which is not necessarily incompatible with the first one, is that actually the DMA is a little bit competition and or industrial policy in regulations closing. And from that point of view, I'd like to share how do I go back up here? How do you back up with this thing? Previous. I'm golden. So I wanted to share this picture. I don't have any, since I say it's regulation industrial policy in sheep's clothing, I looked for sheep's clothing, couldn't find that, so I just got Little Riding Hood and Mare Gras. So if you want, you can imagine your favorite regulator, past or present, in the disguise of Mare Gras. Personally, I actually think that Kai-Uwe would look very good in this costume. So coming back to kind of my new view or complementary view, I think that you can think a little bit of the DMA as responding to this attitude. Look, we have a mess. We have a sector, which is the digital sector, that we don't understand very well, that is moving all over the places. That's moving very fast. And we're pretty convinced there are things there that are not going to go well. And things can become maybe set in stone relatively well. We cannot just say, look, we're going to take 5, 6, 7, or 10 years to figure out what's going on in this industry. So maybe you can think of the DMA and saying, look, we need some order. We need to nail down a few things so that the scenery doesn't go as fast in front of our eyes, and we are able. If you have really, really big things, whether you're a gatekeeper or not, you're not going to be able to tie some activities. You're not going to be able to have kind of naked self-referencing. It doesn't mean that you really want to substitute yourself to competition policy. It doesn't mean that you even believe that this is the right thing to do all the time, but that's a way of putting things in place so that you can figure things out. Now, the problem is that with this view of the DMA, which I think would be quite encouraging and quite honest, runs into the problems that regulations usually have a hard time disappearing once it's there. In the view that I've just mentioned, as we kind of figure out things, as we figure out what are the problems that are anchored in market failure, as opposed to the one that really comes from the abusive, not a dominant position of a gatekeeper's position. So move back other things in competition policy, or then go back to this complementary view of moving them back to competition policy until we're sure enough about what we're doing that we can bring back rules under jurisprudence or under regulation back into a regulatory framework. The problem is that to do that, it requires an openness of mind to kind of saying, yes, some of the things that we prevented before, we should not prevent. Some should go back to competition policy. Some are better dealt with through the traditional soft or hard regulatory framework. And unfortunately, I'm quite skeptical about the ability and willingness of regulatory process and government process to kind of go back and give up on things that they had jurisdiction before. And that's essentially where I'll stop this, fairly rambling, but hopefully somewhat interesting discussion of what the changing interaction between regulation and competition policy might be. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. I don't know whether he's gone, but still our thanks to Pierre for this interesting talk. I think it shows our good internal regulation that we are right on time. You have now the opportunity right outside for lunch, and I would recommend seeking out our speakers for all the questions that you didn't dare ask in the big room. Thank you very much, and see you here back here in 40 minutes.
Thank you.
You're 10 minutes late. You're 10 minutes behind.